Okay, so welcome everyone to this general meeting of the Mid-Missouri Sierra Club Group, and we're happy tonight to have participants from around the state of Missouri from Sierra Club for this special presentation that we're going to have on Missouri river science, the restoration science. I just want to mention a couple of announcements, so let me go back and share my screen real quick. So we have upcoming events. The Mid-Missouri group has adopted a 1/4 mile of a trail in Columbia, the Bear Creek Trail, for invasive plant removal. And we've been working on this for a while and it's still not all gone. So your help is always welcome for those who live nearby. This is held every last Saturday of the month. So upcoming dates are August 27th and September 24th. And more information on all of these will be available. If it's not already, it will eventually be available on our website or the Facebook page, which are down here in the bottom. Our speaker next month should be really interesting and might be something that again interests people from around the state. We're having Galen Gritz speak about the Native American experience in Missouri, and particularly he's a member of the Cherokee Nation, and he's a well-renowned speaker. So that'll be next month's meeting. We will be tabling at the Pride Fest, and it's a 2-day event now, so we could really use some volunteers to help with that. Historically, that's been a really good outreach for us to connect with young people. So anybody that's available to help, please reach out. As we were just discussing, the Columbia Climate and Environment Commission is hosting Doug Tallamy. He is an author who focuses on restoring native plantings and using that as a way of supporting ourselves and our wildlife and pollinators. So that will be open to the public. And when we don't have details like a Zoom or WebEx information yet, but when we get that, I'll be sharing it out. And then following Kansas City's lead, we've started our own book club, but ours focuses on things related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And right now we're meeting in person in Columbia. And for our next book, so the next discussion will be on Our Time Is Now by Stacey Abrams. And this is a book that's a really good intersection of, the efforts made to keep minorities and disenfranchised communities from voting, and Sierra Club's, of course, interest in a strong democracy. So that will be coming up on September 30th. And then the annual Walk for the Climate will be Sunday, October 2nd in the afternoon in downtown Columbia. Don't have all the details on that yet either, but for saving the date. And that'll be a good event to come out for, because it will be a good time for us to reach out to people about the election that will be happening in November. So tonight, so I'll go on now to the presentation. Tonight, we are really pleased to have a very interesting speaker. We already had one general meeting with the USGS where we got to actually tour the lab at the Columbia Environment Center. And that was a really interesting event. So we're really excited to also have connected now with Dr. Robert Jacobson to talk with us tonight. And Dr. Jacobson is the Supervisory Research Hydrologist. He's got 39 years experience with the US Geological Survey, and his specialty area, he's the chief of the River Studies branch. And as most of you know, we frequently in Sierra Club get called on to make comments about things related to the rivers and their management. So this should be really helpful for us, and we're very happy to make the connection. And he leads an interdisciplinary team there in large river restoration strategies. So right up our alley. So with that, I am going to stop sharing here. And Dr. Jacobson, we didn't ask if you had any slides. Do you have something that you want to share?
Oh my goodness, yes, I have slides.
Okay, well then it's over to you.
I can't talk without slides.
Well, it does help, especially in these kind of Zoom meetings. So absolutely. I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, can everybody see my screen? Should be a slide.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, very good. So thanks very much for having me to give this talk, and it's good to see some old friends on the list of our participants as well, and people like Carolyn Pufall, who knows the Missouri River inside and out because she's a delegate to Mr. Rick. I'll have some stuff maybe that'll be new to her, but hopefully provide some stuff that's new to everybody. A little bit about where I'm coming from. Missouri Columbia Environmental Research Center. My branch, the one that I lead, works on topics from endangered species, invasive species, native mussels, floodplain management strategies, adaptive management, collaborative decision-making, a whole variety of things. It's an interdisciplinary branch, and our mission is to do science to inform management and restoration of rivers with an emphasis on large rivers. One question we get asked a lot is, why is the Missouri River involved, or why is the USGS involved in the Missouri River? This statement is from our USGS mission statement, and it talks about what we do in order to collect, monitor, analyze, and provide science about natural resource conditions, issues, and problems. And in italics, our diverse expertise enables large-scale multidisciplinary investigations and provides impartial science information to resource managers, planners, and customers. And that's what our role is on the Missouri River. Importantly, USGS does not manage lands, we don't regulate industries, we don't advocate, and we don't make policy. We just produce scientific information. But we do focus on science that is relevant to federal and state policies and decision-making. And we do have a particular niche in federal concerns because we're a federal agency. So we work with endangered and invasive species and interjurisdictional rivers. And of course, Missouri River has all those things going for it. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about Missouri River as an archetype for difficult environmental management issues, the classic wicked problem. Wicked problems are defined as those that are difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements that are often difficult to recognize. And that certainly fits the Missouri River. I'm going to give a brief background on the context of the Missouri River Basin, because geography really does matter and the history of the river matters. I'm going to outline the management decision-making context, and then I'm going to talk about uncertainties in river science, but I'm going to be specifying or focusing mainly on the pallid sturgeon, which is the species we work with the most. And then I'm going to wrap up with some editorial comments about lessons learned. So first of all, the background. One thing that I think we all know about the Missouri River, but needs to be repeated, is that it's really big. It's the longest river in North America. It has 91 cubic kilometers of reservoir storage in it. That's the largest reservoir system in North America. In a good year or a medium year, it'll produce 10 billion kilowatt hours of hydropower, which is about 1.5 mid-sized nuclear power plants. The lower, almost 1,200 kilometers of it is channelized for navigation, and one estimate for its annual benefits is about $2.7 billion. The basin encompasses 10 parts of 10 states, 2 countries. It has 28 Native American tribes. Many of those tribes have not adjudicated their water rights, so that their senior water rights have not been defined yet. It's got 10 million people in it, which is not really a very high density, but they tend to be 10 million very opinionated people. The Missouri River has certain out-of-basin connections. The hydropower system is hooked up to the electric grid, and so electrical demand and environmental issues that happen in other parts of North America can also affect what happens in the dams that are within the Missouri River Basin. In addition, as we know, the Missouri River exports things down to the Gulf of Mexico, things like nitrogen and phosphorus, which are not so welcome, and sediment, which is welcome. And we've heard a lot recently, at least it's come up in my news feed a lot with the persistent drought out west, about the envy that certain parts of the country have for Missouri River water. There is a out-of-basin diversion that's already in process. The Garrison diversion in North Dakota that takes water to the Red River of the North. In the southern part, the Central Kansas diversion is one that comes up from time to time as planned to be able to recharge the Ogallala Aquifer in central Kansas. And a number of years ago, but recurring, has been this plan from the Bureau of Reclamation to pull water from the Missouri River all the way to Denver. And the reason for doing that is that a lot of the water that goes to Denver and the Front Range actually comes from the Colorado River through another transbasin divide. And so easing up demand for that would help Las Vegas, Phoenix, and the Imperial Valley. So as the West continues in that persistent drought, we've been hearing more about these plans, although it's unsure how serious those kinds of plans really are because they would be very expensive. So the Missouri River has been highly altered in terms of its hydrology. We spend a lot of effort in hydrology and looking at restoration of aquatic ecology because it's really the paradigm. If you want to restore a river, the first thing you need to do is restore the natural flow and sediment regimes. And so we take a look at how that flow regime has been altered. So this, I'm looking right now at the gauge. It's at Wolf Point, Montana. It's just downstream from Fort Peck. And I'm showing two different types of hydrographs on this. The width of the shaded lines is the interquartile range of flows, the flows that happen 25 to 75% of the time. And the blue is the regulated hydrograph, the way it is now with the dams in place. And the gray is the hydrograph before the dams were put in place. And these are modeled data, but they faithfully represent how the hydrograph has changed. So what's happened at Wolf Point is the peaks have been taken off the top of the hydrograph, and then there's higher flows later on in the summer, so that water can continue downstream to help with navigation downstream of Gavin's Point. We go down to Williston, North Dakota, just downstream of the confluence of the Yellowstone River. Suddenly, the regulated and the natural hydrograph look very, very similar. And the reason for that is that the Yellowstone is one of the least altered basins in North America. So the flows that come out of the Yellowstone added to the Missouri River look very natural in terms of this hydrograph. You'll start to see this pattern where there's an early bump to the hydrograph and a late bump to the hydrograph. The early bump is usually in March, and that's melting of water on the Great Plains. And the later one is melting of water from melting of snow from the Rocky Mountains. We go down to Bismarck, we see a very altered hydrograph. It's between Lake Sakakawea and Lake Oahe. And then you see that those peaks are taken off the top and the flows are held fairly steady during the year to maintain water supply and especially navigation downstream. And then we get down to Sioux City, we see sort of the classic altered hydrograph of the Missouri River, the two-peaked natural hydrograph, and then the hydrograph as it exists today, where the water comes up for April 1st to maintain navigation season, and is held very steady throughout the summer and the fall. And in some cases, there's higher flows that are released in the late fall because they have to evacuate the reservoir system for flood control purposes. So it's a very altered hydrograph. As we move downstream to Kansas City and then Herman, we see a lot of that variability coming back because more rivers are coming in that have less regulation on it, but it's a very altered hydrograph. So the hydrograph is highly altered in the Missouri River, but it depends a lot on where you are. And that's something that I think that folks looking at the Missouri River really need to reconcile, that the Missouri River in Missouri is very, very different from the Missouri River in Montana. Another important thing about the Missouri River Basin is it really is dominated by semi-arid climate. So this is a rainfall map or annual precipitation map for the Missouri River Basin. We're all down here in the lower right-hand corner where it's humid and hot, and we're accustomed to a lot of rainfall, but most of the Missouri River Basin is semi-arid, and then there's snowmelt hydrology along the Rocky Mountains. So the hydrology varies substantially, and the problems associated with that vary substantially across the basin. What I've shown in yellow here is just a range of rainfall between 200 and 500 millimeters a year. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is because everything else being equal, that's the range of rainfall that produces the most sediment. That's because there's enough rainfall to transport, to erode soils and transport, but not enough rainfall to maintain a lot of vegetation cover. And so you can see that the Missouri River Basin is really dominated by that range of precipitation. And that means that the Missouri River has always been a sediment producing machine. This graph was taken from a book by Bob Mead, and he had this way of showing loads of constituents are being transported in the Mississippi River Basin by what he called arteriograms. So the width of the river is shown proportional to the load of what he's showing in the arteriogram. In this case, it's the sediment flux that he's looking at. And on the left-hand side, it shows prehistoric, where it shows that the Missouri River dominated the entire Mississippi River basin in terms of the amount of sediment it put into the Mississippi River. And then circa 1980, post when all those dams were put in place, it's still dominating. It's still the dominant source of sediment to the Mississippi River basin, but not by as much as it used to be. And then my colleagues and I recalculated the annual suspended sediment loads. We found that more recently, the sediment load at St. Louis is about 17% of what it was historically before the dams were put in place. It's still called the Big Muddy, and it is a muddy river, but it's nowhere near as muddy as it used to be. And that has implications. One of the big management problems in the Missouri River is where the sediment is accumulating. So this is from Lewis Clark Lake. It shows the Springfield Delta. People used to be able to water ski in this area, and they can't anymore. And it's filling up some of the storage capacity in Lewis Clark Lake. And then there's related problems downstream where there isn't as much sediment available. So interrupting that sediment transport through the system has effects that vary from place to place along the river. Water quality in the basin has obviously been affected. It's highly agricultural basin. On the left here are two different ways to measure nitrogen loads. On the right here are two different ways to measure phosphorus loads. And you can see that they're elevated in parts of the lower Missouri River basin, although not as much as they are in other parts of the Mississippi River basin. There's some information that shows that ecological effects on the Missouri River from heightened nutrient loads are modest, but they are poorly understood. And one of the reasons they're modest is because nutrient loads affect primary productivity, and primary productivity on the Missouri River is constrained by the high turbidity. The high sediment load prevents sunlight getting in and allowing the algae to grow. However, Missouri River clearly exports a lot of those nutrients to the Gulf of Mexico. No. And then there's a question of contaminants. So I've shown here this map. You can see some of the areas of higher concentration population in the Missouri River basin. There was a study that was done in 2019 by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they were looking specifically at, is it possible that contaminants are important in the lack of recovery of the pallid sturgeon? And essentially what they said is that the analogy was, it's like there's a room full of guns that is lots of potential for exposure, but none of the guns are smoking. And what this report really came up with was they don't have enough data to show that there's this effect, or there is an effect between contaminant loading and pallid sturgeon in the Missouri River or some of the other fishes in the river. But there is reason to suspect that something like that could happen. One of the things that we know for sure, though, is that the physical habitat of the Missouri River has been altered very much and very dramatically. So this is a famous painting by Carl Bodmer from about 1833. This is why so many steamboats sank on the Missouri River. It was just full of these snags. And so steamboats hit the snags, and there's records of over 300 steamboats that sank on the Missouri River. Actually, one of my field crews this summer found one of them that hadn't been found before. It's between Rocheport and Boonville. And we're in the process of getting that further explored, and we've registered that with the State Historic Preservation Officer. But anyway, so these snags were taken out of the river in order to support navigation. This is a famous series of slides that is in every talk you ever hear, Missouri River, showing it at Indian Cave Bend, what happened with channelization of the river, how they created land and narrowed the river down to stabilize the banks and decrease the top width to about a third to a half of what it used to be. Another example is this map from 1894 from Herman, Missouri, showing the abundant sandbars and the wide channel. And this is what it looked like after it was channelized. And there's wing dikes, rock wing dikes are shown here in the brown, and there's rock revetment keeping the channel in place along all of the channel now over most of the Missouri River. And so these channel training structures, wing dikes, spur dikes, and L-head dikes are ubiquitous features in the Missouri River and have changed a lot of the processes that are going on in the channel. So all that change the Missouri River has had benefits to socioeconomic values. This is a compilation that is inflated up from a compilation that the Corps did in 1998, showing the authorized purposes: hydropower, water supply, flood control, recreation, navigation, water quality, irrigation, and non-endangered species act, fish and wildlife. And it shows in 5 of those where they monetize those, and this is millions of dollars per year. And it shows, although economists will argue about the precision of these numbers, the general magnitude, I think, holds, and certainly the order of them holds. The big dog is hydropower, which it provides most of the economic benefits to the system, followed by water supply. And in that process, a lot of habitat was lost. This is a compilation done by the Corps for one of the early environmental impact statements, showing over 2,000 square kilometers of habitat altered by the bank stabilization and navigation project. And it's had an effect on biota. There are not too many long-term data sets that show how the biota have changed over time. This is one of them, and it's got some noisy stuff in it that's kind of hard to understand. But this shows when dams were closed in the 1950s that commercial fish harvest crashed after that. Then there was another spike in commercial fish harvest in 1990, but that's because there were rumors that the catfish harvest was going to be closed along the river, and so a lot of fishermen went out and caught a bunch of fish then. But once that was closed, then the commercial fish harvest stayed relatively low. So that's one data set that illustrates what happened when all this habitat changed in the river. Then a compilation by my colleague David Galat showed that 24 native fishes are in decline, 5 are globally impaired, 11 native fishes are listed by the states as imperiled, and there's 1 federal endangered species, which is sort of the poster child of our talk tonight. That is the pallid sturgeon, which is shown on the left here, but it's the right one. Its cousin, the shovel-nosed sturgeon, is to the left of it. It's a smaller, sort of darker fish, and this is the pallid sturgeon. And I bring these up because most of the management actions on the Missouri River are driven by the Endangered Species Act, and the management actions and the science that's applied to it are really focused, have been focused on these 3 species: pallid sturgeon, and then the interior least tern, which is now delisted, but still needs to be monitored, and the piping plover, which is threatened. Both those birds nest on bare sandbars. The pallid sturgeon, though, lives at the bottom of a deep, muddy river. So this is a animation that kind of leaves the illusion of a long, strange trip. And if I do a 3-hour version of this talk, I go over all of these things from 1803 up to 2023 to talk about all the things that have happened on the Missouri River that have created this non-linear history of management actions and science along the river. But to sum that up, instead of going through it, I'll say that there have been decades of floods, droughts, listings, litigation, legislation, and contentious debate over this time period. For the last 37 years, there's been some level of effort to restore the Missouri River. I put that in quotes. Restoration has become increasingly reductionist, that is, really focused on avoidance of jeopardy to those listed species rather than being holistic sort of restoration. And adaptive management is applied since 2008, and then it was rebooted in 2018, most recently with a new Missouri River Science and Adaptive Management Plan. I want to do an aside, though, right now, just to talk about what restoration means. I'm using the word restoration kind of loosely, but in fact, there are some definitions that are pretty precise and should be looked at. So restoration is thought to mean is reestablishment of the natural structure and function of an ecosystem to pre-disturbance conditions, if you can define what that pre-disturbance or prehistorical condition is. It should be self-sustaining and holistic, And my editorial comment is that's actually pretty simple management. If you take man out of the picture and allow a system to evolve back to the way it used to be, you don't have to use a whole lot of science, a whole lot of engineering to have that happen. You just allow it to restore itself. Then there's a concept of reclamation. We have a Bureau of Reclamation, and what they do is they go beyond what the ecosystem used to do, and they try to increase the ecosystem services for human values. So it implies adaptation to serve human purposes, very directed, and lots of engineering involved in that. So most restoration and reclamation is not ecologic. Then there's a concept of rehabilitation, which is closest probably to what's happening on the Missouri River. And that's recovery of a natural ecosystem structure and function, but not necessarily to its pre-disturbance condition. Manipulating individual elements, and this makes it difficult because the science and the engineering have to be good so that you really understand how those elements interact with each other, so don't make mistakes. And this is really the concept that applies to large rivers, where in addition to restoration values, there's also a lot of socioeconomic values. 1995, Jim Gore and Doug Shields wrote this article posing the question, can large rivers even be restored? And they said, well, actually, restoration of large rivers to pristine conditions, probably not practical. There's considerable potential for rehabilitation, the partial restoration of riverine habitats and ecosystems. So one other word I want to introduce, I don't use it very often, but I really like this concept, and that's the idea of naturalization. And these authors said it's an alternative to restoration and rehabilitation. It defines a viable management goal for watersheds situated in landscapes characterized by intensive human modification, which certainly fits the Missouri River. And the thing about this definition is that it acknowledges the concept of natural is a social ecological construct, and that each community socially negotiates an appropriate mix of human and biophysical components. And that is a very good description of what's happening on the Missouri River with the stakeholder groups and the agencies working together in this long-standing negotiation to come up with that appropriate mix. So I just want to say that as an aside. So restoring the Missouri River, or rehabilitating it, was directed specifically for the pallid sturgeon. There's three main groups of things that have been going on in the Missouri River. The first and fundamental one is artificial propagation of the pallid sturgeon. And this is really a stopgap measure to try to get the population up to a level where it can maybe get to be self-sustaining. But the Endangered Species Act does not recognize artificial propagation as recovery of the species. The Endangered Species Act requires a self-sustaining population. So this is being done to make sure the species doesn't go extinct. But what it means is there's actually a lot more pallid sturgeon in the Missouri River than a lot of people think. This table has been broken down into the upper part, which is the Yellowstone and Upper Missouri, and it's broken down into wild fish, what we know from genetics are natural wild origin fish, and then hatchery fish that have been added to the system over the past 30 years or so. And then the lower part, this is downstream of Gavin's Point to actually into the middle Mississippi River. Wild and hatchery, and then you can see the median numbers here. These are from statistical models, and it shows, in the upper river, maybe 251 wild fish. The lower river, as many as 10,000 wild fish in the system. But I will point out, if you look at the lower 95% confidence interval and the upper one, the wide variability, the wide uncertainties, and this is a factor in pallid sturgeon recovery that is hard to avoid. They're hard to sample. It's hard to know how many are there. It's hard to calculate from your sampling what that true population is. So there's always going to be the uncertainties about how many fish are out there. So if there are restoration goals that say, for example, we want 5,000 fish here, that's going to be hard to come into a specific and precise answer. But what this shows is that, for example, in the lower river, 21,000 live, a lot more hatchery fish were stocked in the river. This is that's in the hundreds of thousands. This is 21,000 that have believed to have survived as of 2021 anyway. So it does look like a success. There's fish in the river. Some of those hatchery fish are becoming reproductive. One of the questions is whether they're going to be able to sustain the population. How many do you need to sustain the population? There's a lot of concern in fish propagation about genetic diversity. We want to make sure that breeding them in a hatchery does not diminish their robust genetic backgrounds. And then there's questions about optimum rearing methods and age of stocking and things like that. But anyway, that's a management action. I'm not going to talk anymore about that one. It's been fairly successful. One of the other main management levers is the flow regime, changing the way the water comes out of the dams. You know, like I said, this is the dominant paradigm in river restoration. It's also, following with Mark Twain, a very contentious thing. Whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting over. And anytime groups have talked about altering the way water comes out of the dams in the Missouri River, it's always been very contentious. My colleague David Glott and I wrote this article where we talked about why it was so difficult to get stakeholders to adopt the idea of the natural flow regime. And simply, stakeholders desire proof that there would be ecological benefits and commensurate with their certainty of economic losses. They were certain that if flows, there were more flows or lower flows, whatever it was going to cost them money. The other big management lever on the Missouri River is the channel form. It was narrowed down and all those wing dikes were put in place and it was stabilized. So that's another lever or another vector of the kinds of restorations that take place. And so there have been some really heroic things with side channels that have been built. This is the Overton side channel here in the upper right-hand corner. These donuts were created back in 2004 around Franklin Island. And then on the lower left here, dredging to create emergent sandbars for least turns and piping plovers. And in another paper that David and I wrote, we made the case based on the science that practical rehabilitation of channel form can produce habitat conditions that are intermediate between the modern engineered channel and the historical reference channel. We were trying to find that common ground. And another example is shown here on the left. Is 2007. This is near Little Sioux, Iowa, and a pretty massive rehabilitation project that was done by the Omaha District of the Corps of Engineers. On the right, where you can see how they widened the channel out and created all sorts of diverse habitat back on the side there. And this was mainly for pallid sturgeon habitat. But this shows this concept of changing the physical, the biophysical part of the system, changing the habitats with the hope or the intent that the biology is going to respond to that. So this is kind of holistic and often based on a historical reference condition. There used to be more of that shallow, slow water out there. We'll put some of that back. And also the idea that would increase habitat diversity, which is thought to be a good thing. But it fits into sort of the myth of if you build it, they will come. And that's in contrast to where a lot of the restoration activities in Missouri have actually gone, which is, again, it's reductionist and directed strategy to do exactly and only exactly what's needed for the species of concern. And part of this comes from an article or a book that was written by the National Research Council when they were a series of books that they've done on the Missouri River, where those authors said the Corps of Engineers need to develop performance objectives that are based on ecological and biological variables and designed to determine if compliance actions are reducing jeopardy to listed species. In other words, they were rejecting the idea of just restoring habitat. They said that's not good enough. And you need to make sure that it's really working for the species. So partly as a result of that National Research Council report that came out, the Corps of Engineers and the Water Resources Development Act of 2008, which created Mr. Rick, the Missouri River Recovery Implementation Committee. The Corps of Engineers and the Fish and Wildlife Service and the states got together and said, we need to do an effects analysis. The effects analysis is pretty simple, actually. It's rebooting. It's a timeout to say, what do you know? What do you need to know? And how are you going to manage the Missouri River? So I had the privilege of leading the pallid sturgeon part of the effects analysis. And we did a whole bunch of analysis of the data starting in 2014 and going through 2018. Published these USGS reports as shown up here on the upper left. That fed into the Science and Adaptive Management Plan, which then became attached to and a foundation for the Missouri River Recovery Management Plan Environmental Impact Statement and Record of Decision, which was finally signed off on in 2018. And I had that up for the pallid sturgeon, but there was another group that was doing it for the birds and another group that was doing it for geomorphology and hydrology. So what did we find out about what we need to know? We took that guidance that instead of just looking at a historical reference condition or maybe diversity habitat, what we really need to look at was how do these things affect the species? So what's the fundamental biology of the pallid sturgeon? Yep, the upper part of this here, you can see an adult pallid sturgeon. Reproductive adult pallid sturgeon will migrate hundreds of kilometers upstream when it is ready to spawn. It spawns in a hard, coarse substrate with adhesive eggs. They get fertilized, and then they incubate for 4 to 7 days, and then they hatch into what's shown here in the bottom, a free embryo, which is essentially like an egg, only it's got a head and a tail on it, and it's got this big stomach that's full of, it's a yolk sac that it's feeding off of as it's passively drifting downstream, but getting less passive as it goes along. And that does that for mostly passively for 7 to 11 and maybe 14 days, depending on temperature and the water velocity. And then after about 2 weeks, they develop enough fins that it can hold itself in the current, and it settles into marginal habitats. And then it hangs out there for a while. We don't know a lot of what happens after that first year or so. But what we do know is that after the first year, the annual survival rate of a pallid sturgeon is 65 to 90%. If you get it through that first year, it's in pretty good shape. What we also know is in that first 2 weeks, the survival rate is about 0.02%. The mortality is huge. So that's where they're dying off. And part of that is just natural. That's what they're adapted to. But if that number can be changed, then that can change the population dynamics of the pallid sturgeon. So here's what's resulted from that. On the left is the historically documented range of the pallid sturgeon, all the way from essentially Great Falls, Montana, down to New Orleans. And the present day range is shown here. The Missouri River system's been fragmented by dams, and so the fish can't do those long, really long migrations that they may have used to do. We don't know what those prehistoric, pre-engineered, pre-European history migrations were like. But we do know that there's an upper river population at the confluence of the Yellowstone River and the upper Missouri, and there's zero recruitment. Recruitment being the word that biologists use for saying there's been successful reproduction and they have survived long enough that it looks like they're contributing to the gene pool and contributing to reproduction. And there's zero up there. Again, there are a lot of hatchery fish that have been put up there, but right now there's been no demonstrated recruitment of those fish. The lower river from Gavin's Point Dam down to the middle Mississippi, there's nearly zero recruitment. There are a few fish caught every year that appear to be wild fish. They're not tracked from hatchery stock. We would look at the genetics and figure that out. And so it looks like there's some fish that are recruiting into the population. But what we don't know is if there's enough. It doesn't appear that there are enough to actually grow that population. That's why they're continuing to put hatchery fish in here. And then I'll just note that one of the stressors on the pallid sturgeon is that they can hybridize with the shovelnose sturgeon. Further you go down the Mississippi River, the more that hybridization takes place. And so there is debate among the agencies that are trying to recover the fish and among geneticists about whether the fish that are found now down the Atchafalaya in the lower Mississippi are actually pallid sturgeon or are they hybrids, and therefore should they be protected. So on the Missouri River, we kind of ignore that. We have not been able to ignore the middle Mississippi from St. Louis down to the Ohio, because it does look like fish in the lower Missouri River go back and forth between that part of the Mississippi River, but we've pretty much left the lower Mississippi alone. So another thing that I get asked, and I guess sometimes I feel a little defensive about this, is that why is it that you guys working with the pallid sturgeon know so little when the people who are working with the birds know so much? And the answer really is that you can see what the birds do. And so I just want to show this example here. This is a typical sandbar with a clutch of, I actually don't know if it was terns or piping plover eggs, but the important thing is that if you're a biologist and you want to understand that species and the population dynamics of that species, it's pretty easy because you can count the nests, you can count how many eggs are in there, you can count how many of those eggs hatch and how many of those baby birds fly away, their fledging ratios. So it's something you can definitely see and measure. And the result of that is this kind of mathematical model shown here in the graph, which shows reproductive success of a piping plover. And it's shown here plotted against plover density. In other words, what this shows is if you have a lower plover density, like you have few birds or a really big sandbar, the reproductive success goes up. The more crowded they are, the reproductive success goes down. And so there's a direct connection between the population demographics and a management action. If you want more birds, create more sandbars. And that's a very powerful thing. So it's all based on the fact that you can see these things. And that's not the case with the pallid sturgeon. We are able with the pallid sturgeon to characterize their habitat in great detail. This is part of the lower Yellowstone River in 2015. And all these dots are pallid sturgeon locations. And the background is a very detailed multi-beam bathymetric map that we were using to characterize this habitat, because this is where there was a spawning aggregation of pallid sturgeon. This is one female, which is in yellow, and it was surrounded by 10 males that were hanging out in this spawning aggregation. And we could map this out and characterize that habitat use because the fish were big enough to put telemetry tags in. These are hydroacoustic or radio frequency tags, and if the fish is over, I think if it's over 2 kilograms, we can put those in the fish, and that gives us a lot of capability for understanding what the adult fish are doing. But as I pointed out, the problem is that all the mortality is in these little guys, the fish that are barely 10 millimeters long. That's where survival is 0.02%, and it is extremely difficult to know what's happening to those size fish in a big muddy river. So when we look at Missouri River management for the pallid sturgeon, we do split it into two parts: the upper river, shown here, the confluence of the Missouri and the Yellowstone. And the main hypothesis for why the fish population has been unsuccessful up there has been that there's not enough free-flowing river for that early life stage, the larval fish. Essentially that the fish can't spawn far enough upstream to give it enough downstream travel distance before it gets into Lake Sakakawea. And there is evidence that once it gets into Lake Sakakawea, you have bad water quality or maybe predation or something. But this seems to be why there is no successful recruitment in this area. There's been one confirmed spawn up near Fort Peck Dam, and then many confirmed spawns way down here in the lower Yellowstone. So what the management actions are for dealing with this? Well, of course, stocking is taking place, try to get the population up. A big one, though, was to create a bypass channel here at intake. And this was actually completed this year. And even this year, there's been 20 adult pallid sturgeon that have been documented using that bypass channel. And what that does is it opens up a lot more river to the fish to go upstream to find a place to spawn. And it also opens up things like the Powder River, which is another like 300 miles it can go up the Powder River. So that's a management action that's it's taken place, and there's a lot of science in place right now to try to evaluate how well that's working. But the other management action, and this is the controversial one, is flow management at Fort Peck. The idea that flows could be manipulated out of Fort Peck to attract the fish upstream as far as possible. And then the flows could be cut out of Fort Peck to decrease velocities to give the fish more time to develop as it drifts downstream. And like I said, this is the third rail of Missouri River management, any manipulations of the flow regime. So we've been involved in some fundamental science to try to get a better understanding of how this process works. The question is, how far and fast the larvae disperse on the river? So one of the things we've been doing is develop transport models using assumptions of passive drift to working with active biologically mediated drift. This is an example of a dye trace experiment we did on the Yellowstone River. This is actually quite fun to do. You can turn a big river bright pink, but it helps us develop transport models. I'm not going to go into detail on these, but they are the kind of mathematical models that help us understand how much river does that fish really need. And we can integrate that with the biological models of how fast does the fish develop to the point where it needs to be able to start to settle out. So this is running pretty well on my screen. I hope you're seeing it as well. These are 3 simulation models. It's sort of like the next level of modeling we go to try to understand what are those factors that slow this drift down. How is that affected by discharge, which is a variable that can be managed, and how is that affected by other factors in the channel? What we've also shown on this one is, I'll start this over again, is that there's also 2 different colors of particles shown in these particle tracking models. So we have 2 different populations. We've got one that we can program to act like a fish that's drifting on the bottom of the river. And there's another population we can program so it's acting like a fish that's distributed throughout the water column. And so we can see, based on those 2 different ideas, how that affects how fast these fish move downstream and where they end up. What you can see from this is that some of these fish get caught in places. And in this part of the river system, it really isn't known, is that good or is that bad? It's another area of research needs to be worked on. But those models, working with dye and computational models, are really based on this idea of particles and passive drift. And we know that that is not what these fish are. And so we complement that with flume studies as well. This is a preliminary flume study we did with some colleagues at the University of Minnesota. And which I've shown here on the right is the developmental series of larvae going from 1 day post-hatch to 14 days post-hatch. You see around 14, you can see we've got fins and there's scutes and there's whiskers on this fish. They're really starting to look hydrodynamic like a sturgeon does, where it can hold itself on the bottom. And in this video clip here on the right at 1 day post-hatch zoom, you can see the fish that are that young, they're just passively drifting downstream in the current. They can't hold themselves at all. But at the bottom, you can see these fish by the time it's 15 days post-hatch, they are on the bottom, they're facing into the current, they're holding themselves on the current. And this is a very smooth bottom to this flume. So it shows that there's a developmental sequence that goes on, and we're trying to better understand how that developmental sequence changes how fast they move downstream. And then because people tend to dislike, well, some people don't like computational models and some people don't like things that are done in laboratories, we've also done these large scale experiments in the river. 2016, we put 740,000 1 day post-hatch pallid sturgeon in the upper Missouri River. In 2019, we put 1.2 million fish in the river, and then had crews working for 24 hours a day for 5 days, sampling these fish to see if they're actually moving downstream at the rates that our models are predicting. A lot of effort that goes into those very specific questions, but what's at stake here is the prospect that if we don't know enough about how to be able to slow that down, increase the development or slow down the drift, it may be a place where the fish can never be recovered. So next steps on this, there's a planned field experiment, a flow release out of Fort Peck. This is that same map of Yellowstone here and Fort Peck Lake here, Fort Peck Dam. And what I've shown on here are a whole bunch of telemetry receivers that look like this. So this area has now got an incredible amount of instrumentation in it. There's over 280 fish with tags. And when a flow pulse comes out of Fort Peck, we will be able to know whether those fish feel it and whether they move upstream or not. And then there will be coordinated sampling downstream to see whether the babies make it and live. This is also coordinated with Intake Dam, which is here. Like I said, that project's been completed. And so this network of telemetry receivers is also being used to see how much fish are using that bypass at intake. This is, however, very controversial. The intake was not that controversial. The flow pulse out of Fort Peck, very controversial. On the lower river, we have similar but different hypotheses for what's wrong with fish and why recruitment's not taking place. There's a lot of distance on the lower Missouri River. Gavin's Point Dam is at river mile 811 above St. Louis. And then you can go all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico if you're a little baby fish and if you want to drift a long distance. So it's not the drift distance that is thought to be limiting. It's the condition where that fish needs to get out of the channel. Remember that the channel from Sioux City all the way down, well, all the way down Mississippi River is channelized to maintain navigation. And the hypothesis is that those baby fish can't get out of the navigation channel and into supportive habitats. There's also a hypothesis that the fish, the adult fish, don't have the hydrologic cues to aggregate the fish. These are spawning sites, known spawning sites over a number of years. And one thought is that if fish are spread out instead of aggregating together, that the spawning success will be lower. And another hypothesis is that spawning habitat is not optimal for population growth. So the management actions are stocking, of course, flow management of Gavin's Point Dam, restoration of spawning habitat, and interception rearing complex construction, which is a topic that's been in the news and is close to us in mid-Missouri. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that. And that idea is that for the channelized Missouri River, and what I've shown here is a multi-beam map at the bottom of the river. You can see these huge sand dunes in the navigation channel and the wing dikes that are squeezing the river down and creating high velocities and high sand transport in those areas. The hypothesis is that that channel that was designed to move sand is incompatible with getting a baby fish when it's only 20 millimeters long out of that channel and into supportive habitats where they might be caught. And so the idea is to do some manipulations of the channel geometry, change some wing dikes and things in ways that can create more complexity of flow and allow for secondary currents that would help advect those baby fish into supportive habitats. That's what the interception rearing complex hypothesis is. Interception from the flow and then habitat characteristics in those areas next to the channel that are going to be supportive of the fish. And we have one of these right next to us in Columbia. This is the Searcy's Bend IRC at Huntsdale, Missouri. Some of you are aware of the new Nature Conservancy Missouri River Relief River Education Center, which is here at what used to be Catfish Katie's. This whole bend is one of the experimental interception rearing complexes that's been created on the Missouri River. And these are relatively subtle things. What's shown here in red is where notches were put in some of these structures, and green where some of the structures were increased in length. Relatively subtle. If most people, if they were floating down the Missouri River and went past an IRC, they would not see that there's any real change to it. They are, however, extremely contentious because almost everything on the Missouri River is contentious. And the navigation community and the dredging community, and to a large extent the agricultural community, have been very much in opposition to these. So it's been very difficult to get these done. But this is a computational model from that site. Just turn on its side, and it shows how one of the ideas is to bring water off the outside of the bend here into this area. And then another area is that there's some flow expansion downstream of these wing dikes will create recirculation and bring the baby fish into those areas. And coming out of that Missouri River Science Adaptive Management Plan, there was a very systematic science effort put forward in what's called staircase design to try to evaluate, does this really work or not? And following the concept of adaptive management, here's a hypothesis. Let's go out in the field, do some robust science and find out whether it's working or not. And this involved control bends and treatment bends. And so Circes was one of those treatment bends, and Moberly was one that were created. And they had control bends that were used to compare to before the system was stopped. The Water Resources Development Act of 2018 had this language in it, saying that the Corps needed to provide a report demonstrating that these things didn't affect navigation, flood control, and otherwise purposes, and that they had a positive effect on the population recovery of the pallid sturgeon. That second part is the much harder part to do. And that there would be no additional IRC construction allowed until that report was submitted and accepted by Congress, and that hasn't been done yet. About this time, Representative Todd Graves had this statement. He says, even the Corps has admitted that they are unsure if these structures will help the recovery of the pallid sturgeon in the Missouri River. And this is not an uncommon view coming from a lot of stakeholders. And it gets at the question of how much do you need to know before you can go in the river and test it to see if it works. And one view is that you better be really, really sure before you go in the river and do something. And the other point of view, which errs on the side of the species, is, well, if we're pretty sure it's going to work, let's see. And this is part of one of the conundrums of adaptive management. So I'm going to make a little aside here in adaptive management to talk about this. This is the adaptive management cycle, where you assess a problem, you design a remediation to it, you implement it, you monitor it to find out whether it works, you evaluate it, and if it works, you're done. And if it doesn't, you adjust it, and in some cases, you'll have this single loop you adjust, and you go back and you monitor some more in this loop. And other times, you get up to adjust, and you say, well, we really couldn't do that, and we need to reassess the problem, and then you go around this whole thing again. But the point of view of some stakeholders, and I'm not saying what's legitimate or not, is that we don't have enough information to actually go around this adaptive management loop. Instead, there's what they call the paralysis loop, where you continue to assess the problem, design and assess before you go ahead and implement it. So this is the point of view that starting adaptive management is too risky, even when that adaptive management is really meant to be an experiment for information purposes, not to the level of it where it would really change the entire river or attempt to change the population dynamics of the pallid sturgeon. So we've been in that loop now for a while, since the Water Resource Development Act of 2018. And as a result, our group, working with the Corps of Engineers, Missouri Department of Conservation, Fish and Wildlife Service, and Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, has gone back to doing something where we said, okay, let's look at a whole bunch of wing dikes along the lower Missouri River, and we're going to do AECs. These are areas of enhanced capture. Used to be called hotspots, but then we decided we couldn't call them hotspots. Areas of enhanced capture, and look at those areas where they're already catching all these little fish, learning more about those, and then taking that information and putting it into the design process for future IRCs. So we do a lot of computational modeling, you get a sense of why is this interception happening better in some places. We've done a dye trace right here on the Missouri River near Huntsdale. You can see this is from remote sense imagery. You can see the dye that was placed in the river and going downstream. Then we're using that dye to calibrate and validate computational models like I'm showing here on the right. So here's that IRC at Huntsdale, Sirsi's Bend, and you can see some of these particles going down the Tadpole Island chute, but a lot of them getting caught up and intercepted in this area and moving much slower than through the system than the ones that stay in the navigation channel. So the dye trace and other field data help us compile and calibrate and validate these computational models that can be used for design then and for predictive capacity. So there is so much more I could talk about in the Missouri River, but I'm not going to. I'm going to wrap it up now and go back to this question of long, strange drift, this long, non-linear, up and down system of the Missouri River. I think right now we're not a bad place. Here we are in 2023. The intake bypass has been completed. There's the IRCs are kind of up in the air right now, although the Corps is planning to build another set of IRCs in 2023. There's a record decision for flow manipulations out of Fort Peck. Science is moving along pretty well. So what have we learned? The Missouri River really is a wicked problem, and it's because of this competition between the socioeconomic and the environmental objectives, compounded by the fact that we have pervasive biological uncertainty. It's hard to resolve the conflicts when we're always coming back to the fact that we really don't know what's happening to this rare fish at the bottom of the Big Muddy River. There's been a lot of adaptive management applied to the Missouri River. It's promising, but it is not a universally accepted approach. Many stakeholders are not happy with the idea of experimentation when they believe that experimentation will hurt them. Solutions take a long time. And this is especially true because stakeholders' concerns come and go. Every time there's a period of drought, a whole set of issues come up. There's a period of floods, another set of issues come up. So things go back and forth. And over time, because restoration of a large river like this takes so much time, a number of stakeholders really burn out on the process. The program funding has been volatile. This is program funding from 2004, in millions of dollars per year. The horizontal line on here is what the Corps of Engineers says it needs to manage restoration of the Missouri River. This 2023 is what's been estimated in the president's budget. So you can see this precipitous decline in funding on the Missouri River, which has been quite a concern because it's very hard to continue momentum, continue progress when funding has been cut off to that degree. However, there is some light at the end of the tunnel with the president's budget getting back up in the $25 million range. But what I find encouraging is the science budget shown in red. It's been less volatile. I mean, we took a big hit in 2022, but it stayed at a fairly high percentage throughout this time period. And I think that shows the recognition by the Missouri River Recovery Program, stakeholders, and the agencies that the science is an important part of this, to know if any of this stuff is working and to also improve our ability to make these things work better in the future. So with that, I'd like to shout out to folks on our research team and the agencies that work with us. And I know I've taken up a lot of time, but I'd be happy to stick around and answer questions.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Jacobson. It's really interesting. And now I finally know what those things that stick out in the river are for. I see them when I'm walking on the Katy Trail, and I was wondering what they were for. So if you guys have anyone has a question, you can go ahead and ask it, or if you're more comfortable, you can type it in the chat. So I'll open it up for questions. Carolyn Pufalt, go ahead.
Hi, hey, this is Carolyn Pufalt from St. Louis, and Mr. Jacobson, Rob, thank you so much. That I always learn very much from your presentation. I just wanted to raise one other an additional issue, or an issue that you talked about, which is and I'm mentioning it because I know a lot of Sierra Club folks have heard a little bit about this and are aware of it. And this is the authorization that is in the federal government to mitigate for general mitigation along the Missouri River for lost fish and wildlife habitat. This is not endangered species focused, but it's just, general habitat loss, which, you referred to, and which is, we know that habitat loss is part of the big reason probably why the pallid sturgeon and the two bird species were in trouble and are still in trouble. We have always thought, the club has always thought that, as you have mentioned, there's so much that we don't know. We're always learning, that we want to see as much emphasis as possible put on just general restoration of fish and wildlife habitat along the river. And that could be a parallel or part of pallid sturgeon recovery. I'm glad that you mentioned that the Academy of Sciences booklet, and they've done a couple, mentioned that we can't just do general mitigation for these endangered species. We have to focus on them, on what we know and what we can learn about their habitat needs. But along with that, we are saying, let's also restore the river, because those two things are helping each other. Do you have what's your view on that, and how do you see any hope for improvement overall in the river? I'm sorry for that long question.
No, I think it's a good comment, Carol, and I appreciate that. And I do know it's something that Mr. Rick has been struggling with for a while. I put this slide back up to point out that the bank stabilization navigation project, that is stabilization of the banks and putting all those wing dikes in there, was declared complete in 1981. And the mitigation program, the bank stabilization navigation program, mitigation program, fish and wildlife mitigation program, was authorized in 1986. So right away, it was understood that a lot of habitat was lost and it had to be mitigated. And so some of that work was done starting in the 80s. The mitigation program was expanded in 1999. And then what happened is that the mitigation program sort of got subsumed into biological opinion compliance. And this is that process of going from the holistic view of restoration, which a lot of the BSMP mitigation was, because it was essentially purchasing land and opening up the floodplain, and a lot of it was relatively passive and just allowing the river to do stuff. But the money and the politics and maybe the legal structures, it seemed like the power is coming from the Endangered Species Act. And so the effort was really focused on, well, what can you do for the pallid sturgeon? And one of our colleagues on Mr. Rick at one point said, the Fish and Wildlife Service picked the wrong fish. If they wanted to have holistic restoration of the river, they should have decided that a floodplain fish was endangered, not the pallid sturgeon. The pallid sturgeon is, to all we understand about it, a main channel obligate. It's rheophilic. It lives in the sand dunes. It lives in high current. It doesn't use the floodplain. It's very seldom captured on the floodplain. And so it really suits itself to a restoration program that's focused on the main channel itself and doesn't get into those floodplain lands that the Bank Stabilization Navigation Project Mitigation Program had focused on. So those are some things I know about. I don't understand exactly why there hasn't been more emphasis on mitigation, except that the service, Fish and Wildlife Service, has definitely been focused on the Endangered Species Act, and maybe the political weight from groups like Sierra Club, TNC, et cetera, hasn't been sufficient to keep the agencies from going in that direction. That being said, bank stabilization navigation program is still in the budget for 2023 for the Missouri River Recovery Program. Did that help at all, Carolyn? I mean, it's a big subject.
Oh, yes, yes. And I would just kind of point out that in 1986 and the expansion of the program in 1999, the language is on general restoration.
Yep.
You know, it's not focused on any particular species. We're all very glad to see when, for example, some mitigation land can be used to help develop some of the IRCs that you were talking about, and other targeted habitat, you know, for the birds are the pallid sturgeon, but we just don't want to lose sight of the basic restoration, because if nothing else, we know there are other endangered fish and species on the waiting out and listed, and the
Yeah, and
better and rehabilitate, less likely we'll have species.
that's certainly the pitfall of reductionist and focused restoration actions. There's a bit of hubris involved in it. It's assuming that, well, if we do this to the pallid sturgeon, it'll help all species, or maybe we don't care about those other species. But if you use a holistic approach, then you're setting sort of a wide palette out there of restoration activities that can help a whole variety of different species. And there are some places where, you know, there are some bank stabilization, navigation, mitigation lands out there that are providing those kinds of benefits. And many of you are aware that there have been some efforts now to look at levee setbacks as a management objective to decrease flood risk along the river. And by their nature, they're not being done for pallid sturgeon, but by their nature, when that happens, they are going to be more holistic in sense of providing a wide variety of habitats in the channel and in the adjacent floodplain.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question or comment?
I have a question. I've been arguing with people for years that the Missouri River is muddier now than it used to be because of all the construction and bad use of land. And then we had a speaker at the Historical Society, a Native American who spoke about the way the land used to be before we came and changed it, and how the Missouri River was like feathered throughout, you know, all these little bitty channels throughout the floodplains. And I just couldn't, I thought, aha, see, I've got proof now that the river used to be cleaner. I just don't understand how that could be.
Well, it's because of all the sediment that's been stored in the reservoirs upstream that would have been coming down. You know, a lot of large main stem rivers are turbid by nature. The Colorado River naturally is just chocolate brown most of the time. But that would not be true of the Grand River. It's not true of the Lamine. Should not be true of the Osage or the Gasconade. Those medium-sized tributaries should be running clear most of the time. And it's one of the interesting things about the Clean Water Act is that when they look at sediment as being one of the most ubiquitous pollutants in rivers of all of North America, they tend to treat all rivers the same, whereas these large mainstem rivers often have very high sediment load. So that's you know, the high sediment load of the Missouri naturally is a pretty undisputed fact, but that doesn't mean that the tributaries, which do have a lot of disturbance and a lot of agriculture, putting a lot of sediment into the river, shouldn't be clear and running clear most of the time. Every river will be muddy some of the time. It's a question of how often it's running clear how often it gets turbid. And like I said, the Missouri River most of the time would be turbid. It's only carrying right now 17% of the sediment it used to kind of carry.
And a follow-up question, if those little fish glue themselves to something and there's silt on everything, what do they glue themselves to?
That particular life stage transition is one that we are trying to measure in the field or in the laboratory. That's something that's very hard to measure in the field because a lot of this has to do with the habitats that the adults, reproductive adults, are selecting in order to spawn. And also something that's very difficult for us to document is how far above the bottom of the river do they spawn. We think we know that most of the time they'll spawn over coarse, hard rock. And they're benthic fish. They tend to be right at the bottom of the river. So we're assuming that when they release their eggs, it's just within maybe millimeters or centimeters from the bottom. We also know that when they migrate upstream, because we'll be able to follow them, when they migrate upstream, they migrate through the lower velocities. But when it comes time to spawn, they go over to the deepest, fastest area over coarse rock, and that's where they spawn. So those are areas that they're selecting that are probably going to be clean of silt, even in a highly turbid river, at least right down near the bottom. But we'd like to be able to document that in the laboratory with some better observations, because what's tied into is the fact that when the eggs are initially released, when the fish spawns, they are not adhesive. It takes a minute or two before that adhesion starts up, and so those eggs, we have calculated, could in fact be transported hundreds of meters downstream before they're ready to adhere to the substrate. So it's a little bit more, well, like a lot of science, we've made it more complicated by learning more. But good question, Christine.
Anyone else? Well, seeing no hands or chat questions, I want to thank you, Dr. Jacobson. This has been very interesting, and I know that it'll be really helpful for all of us as we go forward doing the work that we do in Sierra Club. So we really appreciate you taking the time this evening with us.
Good, it's my pleasure. And I'm glad that some of you were able to come out to see our lab. And we're going to be open, of course, for anybody who wants to come out and see the lab again. Later on this month, we are installing a very large flume that's going to be used to do a lot of this experimental work to get a better sense of answering that question Christine had, with exactly what happens with these fish in the wild.
Right, I was really interested in the outdoor things that you had too, where you could like create a stream flow. I thought that was a neat section of your lab. So yes, and I would encourage even those people from around the state, if you want to have an interesting road trip someday, it's definitely worth a drive to come and see it if you're interested in the toxicology of fish and things like that. So, all right, well, I want to thank everybody for attending. I also want to thank Brooke Fletcher, who is the Sierra Club volunteer member who arranged tonight's presentation. We're all volunteer here in mid-Missouri, so we couldn't do it without the work of the volunteers. So thanks very much, Brooke, for your efforts scheduling Dr. Jacobson. And I will send out, the presentation has been recorded, so I will send it out to the Sierra Club Missouri Leaders List, as well as it will be posted in our Mid-Missouri Sierra Club Facebook group. So with that, I'll go ahead and close the meeting tonight and say thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thanks, Dr. Jacobson. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you.